lockjaw. If Alan were to have received a solo title at this time, I would have wanted it to be written by Mr. Thomas and penciled by Mr. Freeman. So with History of the DC Universe and Secret Origins, it looked like Alan's place within the post-crisis DCU was affirmed, was secured. And so a lot of readers were probably thinking that those yearly JLA, JSA team-up stories could happen on a much more frequent basis now, because there was no need to explain that a year had passed, or there wasn't a need for some other plot contrivance to explain how the interdimensional barriers were broken down so that heroes from Earths 1, 2, 4, S, X, and so on could cross over. Now it was just a matter of the heroes traveling from city to city, or at the most country to country, to team up. And so DC certainly appeared interested in showing heroes who were formerly separated by interdimensional barriers teaming up on a month-to-month basis. The best example of that being Keith Giffen and J.M. DeMatteis's Justice League, where readers saw Dr. Fate, Blue Beetle, and Captain Marvel all on the same team. Sadly, though, it appeared that DC was interested in taking this route only when it pertained to heroes of the current, or what was then the present day, generation. And the History of the DC Universe and Secret Origins showed quite clearly that the JSA was still deeply rooted in World War II. It would become apparent early on that DC editorial wanted to put its Golden Age characters on the shelf in order to focus on the younger heroes. And we could see that on one end with John Byrne being called in to revamp Superman, Frank Miller being called in to give Batman a fresh start, George Perez coming in, giving Wonder Woman a reboot. But what about the JSA? Well, in order to give the JSA a send-off and to put the team to rest for the foreseeable future, DC turned to its Earth 2 architect, Roy Thomas. And for those of you who haven't listened to my spotlight on Alan Scott in the Bronze Age episode, just to recap, it was Roy Thomas who really chronicled a large chunk of Earth 2's history through his books All-Star Squadron and Infinity Inc. I mean, Earth 2 was really a viable continuity in and of itself by the end of the pre-crisis era. And I have to side with Adam Murdo and other podcasters who said that Roy Thomas was really a good sport in heeding the call from DC to write a story that would put the JSA into textual and metatextual limbo. And that story was Last Days of the Justice Society of America, which, by the way, I can tell you, has very recently been re-released in trade paperback format. It's a 68-page one-shot, but it's supplemented by perhaps not all, but most of the Secret Origins stories that were written by Roy Thomas. A great read. Now, Last Days was really a product of its time. It was during that merged Earth or Earth Sigma period where the heroes remembered the crisis and they remembered that there was an Earth 2. And so while there are elements of Earth 2 history and flashbacks involving the Earth 2 or Golden Age versions of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, Roy Thomas does a very good job through the dialogue of a number of characters, particularly Hawkman, in letting new readers know that there was a crisis and the JSA now found themselves on this merged Earth where everybody remembered them being part of this Earth's history, but the JSA knew otherwise. And they felt like they were in their twilight now, and it was time for them to retire. But then a sickly, dying Spectre appeared, and with his last breath imparted some important information to Dr. Fate, who then told the JSA what was going on. Turns out that in 1945, near the end of World War II in Europe, Adolf Hitler decided that if he couldn't have the Earth, nobody could. And so what he did was he finally unleashed the full power of the Spear of Destiny, which would ultimately bring about the destruction of the Earth. And the destruction of the Earth will come about through Hitler using a Spear of Destiny to open up a breach in which Loki and other demons of legend travel to Asgard to have one final climactic battle with the Norse gods, Thor, Odin, Heimdall, the rest. And this final battle would be the ultimate apocalypse. This would be the Ragnarok, the destruction of everything. And so Dr. Fate transported the JSAers to the astral plane where they could see the battle, which would result in the twilight of the gods, starting to unfold. And so Dr. Fate, with an assist from Alan Scott's Emerald Energy, kept the battle from falling in Loki's favor by merging the essences of the Norse gods with the members of the JSA. And so, for example, Alan Scott was merged with Thor. Now, Power Girl and Star Spangled Kid initially were part of the battle, but then they were separated from the Norse gods by Dr. Fate, who told them that they would be needed elsewhere. And he just wanted them to witness what happened. And the battle basically ended with the JSA Norse god combination kind of sort of winning. It was more, I'd say, a stalemate than anything. Many of the JSAers died in the battle. Alan Scott was one of them. But then fate told the two young heroes to look further. And what they saw was that the battle went into rewind and started all over again with Loki and the demons approaching Asgard. Alan and the other fallen JSAers all came to and went back into battle. And Fate explained that in order to keep the Ragnarok from coming to Earth, in order to stop the twilight of the gods, this now had to be a cyclical, never-ending battle in which Loki's side, as well as the Norse gods' side, would live, fight, die, and be reborn. A pretty horrific existence. And Dr. Fate would send Power Girl and Star Spangled Kid back to Earth, and then the seemingly revived Spectre would step in and tell Dr. Fate that he too was needed back on Earth. So to Dr. Fate's credit, he wasn't being a hypocrite. He wasn't trying to keep himself out of the battle. He actually wanted to merge with one of the Norse gods and fight alongside his comrades, but it was the Spectre who stopped him. And so, in the conclusion, the three surviving JSAers met with the Infinity Inc. and explained that the JSA were now in a limbo state. And the term limbo has been used here, although over the past 20 years, the term limbo has been used to mean other things within the DC universe. Most notably, limbo has been the place where certain characters have been consigned to due to certain actions making them worthy of entrance into neither heaven nor hell. Limbo has also been a place for characters who have fallen out of favor with the company and have just been put into this sort of nebulous existence until a writer or creative team comes along and decides to pick up stories with those characters. Now, oddly enough, Last Days ended with the three surviving JSAers, as well as Infinity Inc., knowing what happened to the JSA, but there must have been some sort of retconning, or maybe it was the effect, the final crisis wave having an effect on everyone's memories, but within a few months, nobody knew where the JSA had gone. It was like they'd all gone into some sort of witness protection program and had no time whatsoever to tell their loved ones where they were going. In terms of why certain characters weren't thrown into limbo, well, during the Bronze Age, the Spectre had migrated to Earth-1 and bonded with the Earth-1 Jim Corrigan. But in terms of Dr. Fate, Power Girl, and Star Spangled Kid, it was easy enough to explain why Dr. Fate stayed eternally youthful. Power Girl and Star Spangled Kid were still seen as young characters who could be repackaged and therefore be profitable to the company going ahead. Indeed, Power Girl would be repackaged as the granddaughter of the ancient Atlantean sorcerer Orion. She had been Supergirl's pre-crisis doppelganger, but even in the pre-crisis era, Power Girl was older than Supergirl. She had a different look to her, a different personality, so she never really felt like a doppelganger to begin with. Sylvester Pemberton would hang up his Star Spangled Kid costume. He'd adopt a new costume and go by the name Skyman until his unfortunate demise. Dr. Fate, there was no need to repackage him, except to make him a founding member of the post-crisis Justice League, later Justice League International. I think a lot of fans realize that Roy Thomas was not the one who they should be angry about. He was not the one that they should pin all the blame on for the JSA's placing in publication limbo. Roy Thomas was a well-respected writer at that point, and he wrote a darn good story in Last Days. He gave the JSA a very heroic send-off, made them appear not just heroic as ever, but very sympathetic as well. They were making a very noble sacrifice, one in which they would never be able to stop fighting. They would never get an eternal rest. They would just be out there somewhere. And so going forward, DC did a pretty good job, I have to say, of not referencing the JSA and its individual members. The focus really was on the modern generation of heroes. And again, a lot of this was because leading up to Crisis on Infinite Earths, the feeling within the company was that the multiverse was too hard for new readers to get their heads around. It was too hard for them to navigate their way through multiple versions of Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman. The thought was that new readers wanted to focus on the younger 20-something, 30-something-year-old heroes. I mean, that argument has of late proven to be complete bunk. Actually, not just of late. I mean, for the past 10 to 15 years, people have been talking about how the multiverse was actually a very useful thing in explaining different issues in continuity and being able to ensure that every story in DC's history counted. The idea of people not being able to work their way around multiple characters with